Hello, lovely people. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Tonight we're stepping into London. It's spring, and somewhere in Mayfair on a good street, a young woman is standing in front of a mirror. She's 17, perhaps 18, and in a few weeks, everything she was and everything she could become will be evaluated by strangers. This is the story of the London season. Not the glamorous version. Not the one that ends in a happy marriage by the last chapter. The machinery underneath. The version where the rules were precise and a single misjudgment could close a door that would never open again. If this kind of storytelling helps your evenings wind down, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I genuinely love knowing. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already. Let whatever was pressing on you today begin to settle. Let's go back together. A debutante's presentation to the Queen lasted 30 seconds. To reach that moment, she had sat in stopped traffic for up to 6 hours. She was in full court dress, 3 white ostrich feathers pinned into her hair. That image stays with me. A girl sitting perfectly still in a stopped carriage, while London moved around her. What were the rules that could end a season before she knew she'd broken one? Why did her one genuine power become a trap the moment she used it? What happened to the families who spent everything and received nothing back? Who were the 454 American women who came to change the mathematics? Why did success and failure look identical from the outside until the day they didn't? What does a dance card with empty lines look like when the whole room can see it? And what actually happened to the girl who went home at the end and nobody had asked? She had 4 months, and it begins in April. The house has seen quiet all winter, not the quiet of a place holding its breath. The genuine quiet of somewhere settled into its own rhythm, with nothing asking anything of it, nothing watching. The mornings came in slowly, grey and cold, through windows that had no particular need to impress anyone. The fires burned in their grates without communicating anything to anyone. The servants moved through the rooms the way people move when they know exactly where they're going. No particular hurry about it. Country life for a family of this kind had a texture that's easy to underestimate from the outside. The afternoons were long and unpressured. The evening settled in early without obligation. A woman in this household could sit by the fire with a book for 3 hours. Nobody would assess whether the choice of book said something revealing about her character. She could walk in the garden before breakfast without thinking about which direction she chose or whether anyone noticed. The rhythm of the house was entirely its own. Nothing external was shaping it. For a young woman preparing for what was coming, that unobserved state was precious. She may not have had the words to name why. In April, all of that ended. Not dramatically, not all at once. It ended with the sound of trunks being brought down from storage, with the arrival of the extra staff taken on for the weeks of preparation ahead, with the lady's maid appearing at breakfast with the list, and the housekeeper appearing shortly afterward with a different list, both of them with the quiet urgency of people who know the clock is running, whether or not the household has noticed. The trunks were cold to the touch when the footman carried them down. They'd been in storage since October, in rooms without proper heat for months. They smelled of cedar and old tissue paper, and the faint preserved warmth of wool packed carefully and left alone. The sound of them coming down the stone stairs was deliberate and different from the ordinary sounds of the house. Heavier, a sound that said something was beginning, and the beginning had already arrived. That sound meant London. It meant May and the season, and a specific kind of sustained performance. Tonight I want to hold that sound a moment before we go further. A cold country house in April. Trunks coming down stone stairs, something beginning. It would run from 10 in the morning to 3 the following morning, without a single day free. And it all started here, in the cold of an English country house that had been genuinely peaceful all winter, with the smell of cedar and the weight of trunks on stone stairs. The country house was being folded away. The London house had to be opened. Most families of this period didn't maintain a permanent London address. Running a London house year-round was difficult to justify when a seasonal rental was available. 4 months didn't warrant a permanent address, so a family rented. For the season, roughly May through late July, they'd take a furnished house in the right part of London. They'd pay what the landlord required. They'd move in with their staff and their trunks and everything the season would demand. A proper seasonal rental ran into several £100s before a single invitation had been accepted. That was rent alone. It didn't include the additional staff needed to run a London establishment at the season standard. It didn't include the fresh flowers ordered twice a week for the drawing room, or the coal for fires in rooms receiving callers from morning onward. The bills came steadily from the first day of occupancy. They were understood not as extraordinary expenses, but as the ordinary cost of the thing. The dress itself carried its own weight. Not the neighbourhood alone, though the neighbourhood mattered considerably. The specific street within the neighbourhood carried meaning that both sides of any social transaction could read instantly. A house on an appropriate street announced itself without comment. A house on a slightly less desirable street required care in how one mentioned it when asked. The naming had to manage the impression before the listener formed their own. Careful management of the address was already a form of apology. An apology, at the very beginning of a season, was not the foundation anyone wanted to be building on. A family rented the best house on the best street they could afford. If the cost exceeded what they'd planned, they absorbed the difference. Beginning the season at a visible disadvantage meant spending the rest of the season trying to recover from it. A season spent in recovery wasn't the same thing as a season that had started level. The specific streets that mattered most were concentrated in a small geography. Mayfair and Belgravia and the streets immediately surrounding them constituted the inner register. Park Lane and Grosvenor Square were statements. Brook Street and Bruton Street were appropriate and needed no explanation. The gradient descended from there in steps invisible to anyone outside the system and entirely legible to anyone within it. Now the address was the foundation. What she wore on top of it was the argument. A debutante didn't wear the same type of dress from one kind of occasion to the next. The dress codes were specific, visible, and understood by everyone in any room she might enter. A morning dress was a different garment from an afternoon dress. An afternoon dress was different from a dinner dress. A dinner dress was different from a ball gown. A ball gown worn on Thursday before certain company could not reappear on Saturday before the same company. That rule wasn't written in any published document. Nobody needed to write it. It functioned quite reliably on its own. The cost of a complete season wardrobe, across all required categories for all required occasions, could reach several £100s. To understand what that meant, consider what it represented. A skilled domestic servant in this period earned somewhere between £25 and £30 in an entire year. A lady's maid, a senior housemaid, someone a household genuinely depended on. A season wardrobe cost something approaching 10 times that annual wage, and yet the wardrobe was understood not as luxury but as necessary equipment. Like a surgeon's instruments. You couldn't do the work without the tools, and the tools had a cost, and that cost was paid, because the wardrobe was being read. Every element of what she wore was being read in real time by everyone in every room with the training to read it. The dress communicated, the gloves communicated, the quality of the fabric, the freshness of the trimmings, the flowers she carried, the shoes beneath the gown. Anything below the expected standard sent a specific message about the limits of what was available, and messages in this world travelled before anyone had a chance to manage them. I find it worth pausing on that. Every piece of clothing she owned was a public statement, not a private choice. A statement being read and filed by people who had spent their entire lives learning how to read it. I'll come back to what this felt like from the inside, the women who kept accounts of it, the letters and the diaries where they said what they actually thought. But there is still the preparation to get through first, and the preparation is its own story. And then there was the preparation that wasn't about objects at all. Professional curtsy instructors were a real, paid profession in London in this period. Families who could afford to hire one did. The instructor would come to the house, sometimes for several consecutive days. The entire purpose was to teach one young woman to perform one specific movement with a trained performer's precision. She practiced the descent, the held pause at the deepest point, the controlled rise, and then the thing that I find most remarkable about the entire procedure, the backward walk. The court protocol required that no one turn their back on the sovereign while withdrawing from the royal presence, which meant that after the curtsy, after all of it, she had to walk backward, away from the Queen, through a doorway she couldn't see, managing a 4-yard train on the floor behind her, without stumbling, without glancing behind her, with composure. Nobody is naturally good at walking backward through an unseen doorway while managing a 4-yard train. Every person who practiced this felt, at some point in the repetitions, at least slightly absurd. And yet by the morning of the presentation, the hours of practice had accumulated into something automatic. The body had learned the path without the mind directing it, which was the intention. On the day itself, she wouldn't have time to think. There's something in this that captures the season's broader logic. The season wasn't designed to be navigated consciously in the moment. It was designed to be prepared for, specifically and intensively beforehand. The preparations were supposed to do the work. The conscious mind was supposed to be occupied with appearing natural, while the trained body carried everything else. She practiced. The instructor corrected. The curtsy was performed again. The repetitions stacked up. The body stored each one until the body simply knew. Eventually, the morning of the presentation arrived and the preparation held. The physical preparation was something she could feel and measure. The social preparation required something harder. There were also lessons in conversation, not in what to say, but in the form that appropriate social speech was supposed to take. This distinction matters because it reveals something precise about the season's structure. The form was what was taught. The content was almost beside the point. What the lessons covered was how to receive a compliment without appearing falsely modest or too visibly pleased, how to steer away from any subject she didn't have clear business having an opinion on, which covered most subjects of genuine interest, how to maintain warm, engaged, pleasant conversation for 45 minutes without revealing anything she hadn't already decided to reveal. The topics ruled out were extensive and well understood. Money was entirely off the table in polite social conversation. Mentioning it directly was vulgar. Mentioning it indirectly in the wrong company could travel in the wrong direction before the visit was finished. Politics was outside the scope of what a young woman in her first season was supposed to be engaging with. Real personal opinions on any subject requiring a genuine position were too dangerous. Opinions could become evidence. Evidence needed managing. What was left was pleasant conversation. The weather, the season's social calendar, the health of mutual acquaintances, conducted warmly, engagingly for a specific duration, with the complete appearance of ease. Here's what I find quietly extraordinary about that. The intelligence required to do this well was real and considerable. The women who navigated this correctly were not less intelligent than the ones who stumbled. They read every room, managed every piece of information across 4 months, and emerged intact. They were differently deployed. Their intelligence had been redirected into impression management rather than expression, into reading the room rather than contributing to it, into being warm and present and entirely non-threatening to every person who mattered in the room. A truly clever girl had to hide her cleverness, because cleverness, displayed openly, suggested opinions she hadn't been invited to have. I sit with that one. This season required intelligence to navigate, and then it required that intelligence to be invisible. But preparation only got her to the door. What was on the other side was controlled by someone else entirely. The social calendar she was preparing to enter was organised around a set of fixed anchor events. The Queen's Drawing Room opened the season formally in May. Royal Ascot came in June. The Henley Royal Regatta in late June. The Eton versus Harrow cricket match at Lord's. And threading through all of it, the great private balls given by the important hostesses through June and early July. These events weren't optional for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously. Attendance was the work. An unexplained absence required a serious explanation, and nobody wanted to be giving one in the middle of the season. The invitations to the events that genuinely mattered were controlled by a small number of women. The private balls, the small dinners, the gatherings that constituted the inner register of the season. All of it passed through very few hands. The great season hostesses, women who had been navigating this world for decades and had developed by practice a reliable and precise social instinct. Women like Lady June, who published her memoirs and left a detailed account of this world from its centre. Women who knew which girls were worth including, which girls weren't quite right, and which girls would simply not do. An invitation from one of these houses was a signal to the rest of the network. It communicated that a girl had been evaluated and found acceptable by a reliable authority. The absence of such an invitation was also a signal. Both travelled at the same speed, through the same channels, and both were read with equal precision. She was being assessed from the moment the trunks came down the stone stairs in April, not by a single test on a single day, but continuously by a network of people comparing notes. The season hadn't started yet. The assessment had already been running for weeks, and she knew it. She had understood it in a general way for most of her life. But knowing a thing in the abstract is different from feeling its weight in the particular. In April, with the trunks on the stairs and the lists already being written, the weight became particular. And all of that preparation led to one morning in May. There was a particular stillness to the morning of a court presentation. Not an empty stillness. A stillness that had weight to it. Everything that could be done in advance had already been done the evening before. The dress had been pressed and laid out. The feathers had been pinned into their exact position, the angle checked and rechecked until it held. 3 white ostrich feathers, not 2, not 4, 3. The white gloves had been placed beside the dress, soft and carefully folded. The court train had been folded to keep it smooth across her lap in the carriage. Without wrinkling, everything had been done. The morning had nothing left to ask of her. That kind of stillness is its own difficulty. There is nothing to do. The preparation is complete. The only remaining thing is to go. And going means entering a carriage and moving through London to the place where 30 seconds of performance will happen, and then it will be over. She dressed in the court dress. It was not a comfortable garment by any ordinary measure. A formal evening gown, cut low and white, with a court train of specified length attached at the shoulders. She was wearing a garment designed for a different hour than the one she was putting it on in. The morning was May. The gown was midnight. That was simply what the day required. She would also carry a small bouquet of flowers, a fan, and a small purse. The season's dress conventions were specific about what formal occasions required a woman to carry. A court presentation was the most formal occasion the season produced. Everything had its particular object. Everything had its particular place. She was dressed, equipped, and waiting to go. The way a person might be dressed and equipped for a very particular kind of work. The white gloves went on last, soft, fitted, buttoned at the wrist. The train was arranged across her lap as she settled into the carriage. The 3 feathers pressed gently against the carriage ceiling as she sat upright. Outside the window, London was already well into its morning. Ordinary London. People walking, shops opening, carts moving freely. Inside the carriage, she did not move. That was the beginning of the wait. Here is the detail that surprises people when they first encounter it. I think it ought to be stated plainly. The wait was not 30 minutes. It was not even close to an hour. On court presentation mornings, the carriage queues in London stretched for miles. Every family of consequence with a daughter to present was sending a carriage that morning, all of them moving toward the same destination at the same hour. The documented wait was between 5 and 6 hours. 5 to 6 hours, in full court dress, in a carriage that was not moving, in May. It sat in a queue of identical carriages, each carrying a similarly dressed passenger, each set of feathers pressing against its own ceiling, each pair of white gloves in a similarly still lap. Through the window, the scene in both directions was the same. Carriages, horses, the occasional pedestrian moving freely past vehicles that were not moving at all. The ordinary world going about its ordinary morning around a queue of women in full formal stillness. The same morning, the same street. 2 entirely different versions of an ordinary Tuesday in May, separated by the glass of a carriage window. The street vendors who worked the London streets had, by this period, learned to recognize a court presentation morning. Accounts described them moving through the stopped carriages selling food. I want to pause on that image for a moment. A vendor selling sandwiches between stopped carriages of women in full court dress, 3 white feathers in their hair. As images go, that is a fairly complete one. The vendors had assessed the situation and adapted accordingly, which was practical. The women who were hungry could eat in their court dress and wait for the queue to move. History doesn't record how many of them took the option. The heat built as the hours accumulated. A May morning in London, a closed carriage, a formal evening gown, white gloves covering both hands, the particular warmth of sitting very still in full formal dress for hours, trying to keep the dress smooth and the feathers precisely positioned, the body wanting to shift and the dress not permitting it. The stillness required was a sustained physical effort, not a natural resting state. By the time the carriage moved toward the gates, she'd been in stillness for most of the working day. But it wasn't only physical. There is a particular quality to waiting that has a fixed endpoint and an undisclosed outcome. She knew the wait would end when the carriage moved. She didn't know yet what the morning would produce. The waiting room before any significant event has a specific feel to it. This one lasted 5 hours and involved ostrich feathers. There's a particular kind of alertness that forms in sustained waiting when the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Not anxious, exactly. More like a state of managed readiness. A person in that state becomes very attentive to small things. The sound of the carriage ahead of her moving, the particular quality of the light through the window, the position of her own hands in her lap, the weight of the train across her knees, small details that filled the space where active thought wasn't permitted. The body, having been trained, had its own way of staying ready. The preparation had its own form of patience. It simply waited. And the waiting was not empty, because the body full of trained responses is not an empty body. It had been given work to do. It was simply holding that work until the moment arrived. The dress she was wearing had requirements that had been published in advance. Each year before the season opened, the Times and other London newspapers printed the court dress regulations. These were not vague suggestions. They were specific and absolute. 3 white ostrich feathers, always 3, positioned using a purpose-made hairpiece at the correct angle. The court train attached at the shoulders, of minimum specified length, trailing behind her on the floor. The gown itself white, or a very pale shade that would read as white in the palace light. The cut formal and appropriate for a full evening occasion, regardless of the morning hour. Coloured feathers were not acceptable. Headdresses that deviated from the published standard were not acceptable. The code was specific enough that deviation was not a matter of interpretation. It was simply wrong, and it would be noted, and it would be remembered. A woman who arrived in coloured feathers had made a visible error. So had one with a train of the wrong length, or a gown not correctly white. Not an interpretive difference, a visible failure to comply with a published standard. In a world where the network noted and remembered, visible non-compliance was a piece of information. It said something about the family's commitment to the season's requirements. And information like that travelled quickly. There was also the matter of cost. White ostrich feathers of the quality required were imported from southern Africa. The expense was significant against a wardrobe budget already extended across the whole season. They would be worn once, one morning. No other occasion in the season's calendar called for them in precisely the same way. One wearing, one purpose. The carriage moved, eventually through the gates. The approach involved a sequence of rooms. The women arrived not as individuals but as part of a continuous movement. They passed through gates, across the courtyard, and into a first antechamber. Then a second. Each room brought them forward. The palace had in these rooms a particular quality of silence, the kind that forms when a large space is moved through with deliberate care. The carpets were thick enough to quiet footsteps. The air was different from ordinary London air. Everything was slightly more formal than even the most formal drawing room she'd ever entered. There was nothing she had to do in these rooms except move forward and wait her turn. No conversation was required. No impression management was active in the same way it would be in a drawing room. The assessment running in the palace anteroom was different. It was observational. People in these rooms were watching closely. How she moved, how she held herself, whether the preparation showed in the way she carried it. Even in the waiting she was being read. There was a detail about the court circular that the entire network understood clearly. The following morning, the Times printed the complete list of every woman who'd been presented the previous day. Every name. The list ran in the newspaper alongside parliamentary business and official government affairs. This tells you exactly how the event was regarded. Being on the list was confirmation in print. Not appearing on it required explanation. In a small, tightly connected social world, silences were noticed as readily as statements. The absence of a name was registered before anyone needed to ask, and there was a practical consequence to appearing on the list. In the days following, a girl who had been presented could expect an increase in morning calls received. The network had seen her name confirmed in print, and confirmation was a signal to engage with more attention. The machinery of the season operated on signals. The court circular was one of the most legible ones it produced. The chain of presentation itself had a structural fact that mattered in practical terms. Only a woman who had herself been presented could present another. A mother who had not been through the process could not present her daughter. This created a chain of validation running backward through generations. Each woman who presented had herself been presented by someone else. The chain was its own credential. A girl without an eligible female relative who had been through it faced a practical problem. It had to be solved before the morning could be planned. It was possible to find a sponsor outside the immediate family, but it required the right connections. The right connections required the network, and the network required an established standing she was in the process of trying to acquire. The process of finding a sponsor and the social price of needing one required careful management. Approaching the wrong woman for the favour risked a refusal that would itself become information. Approaching the right woman and securing her agreement created an obligation that would need to be honoured across the season. The sequence of rooms narrowed. The queue moved forward in small, careful increments. And then it was her turn. The body knew what to do. The months of repetition had accomplished what they were supposed to accomplish, and the conscious mind stepped to one side. The curtsy descended smoothly. The held pause at the deepest point. The controlled, fluid rise. None of it was experienced consciously in the moment. It simply happened, the way things happen when they have been rehearsed past the point where thought is needed. The sensation, by all accounts from women who left descriptions of it, was less of triumph than of relief. Not the relief of something wonderful happening, the relief of something necessary being correctly completed. The curtsy had been practiced enough that it felt like memory rather than action, and memory, when it executes correctly, produces a particular quiet satisfaction. It says the work was done well enough, which was, in a world that measured adequacy with great precision, exactly the right thing to feel. Then the backward walk, the train behind her on the floor, the doorway she couldn't see. Steady, backward steps, the body carrying its stored knowledge without hesitation. She didn't look behind her. She didn't need to. 6 hours in the carriage. 30 seconds of performance. The carriage returned through the London streets. The same dress, the same feathers, the same white gloves resting softly in her lap. She sat in the same posture she had held for 5.5 hours. The external details were unchanged, but the morning was different now. She was on the other side of the one thing it had required. The presentation was not an achievement. It was the entrance fee, and the entrance fee had already been paid in full before the carriage queue even formed. In the months of preparation, in the curtsy instructor's hours, in the feather merchant's bill, in the rented house on the right street, in the lessons in conversation. The 30 seconds of performance was simply the moment when the payment was received and acknowledged. What came next was the season itself, and the season was what everything had been paid for. The dance card was still packed in the wardrobe trunk, waiting for a ball that hadn't happened yet. The morning calls were being planned. The drawing rooms were opening. The assessment hadn't paused for the presentation. It had no reason to regard it as anything except the expected minimum. It moved forward. It noted that this name now had its required entry in the required column, and then it continued the work it had already been doing for several weeks. What the morning had done was establish a baseline, not a high one, not one that distinguished her from anyone else in the queue. All of them had been presented. All of them were now officially participants. What differentiated participants was everything else, and everything else was still ahead. The presentation was the entry. What followed was the game, and the game had rules that nobody had written down and everyone knew. The morning call was the most important unit of the London season's social machinery. Not the ball, not the dinner, not the drawing room. The morning call, the thing that happened in the hours after breakfast, in a drawing room for 15 to 30 minutes, with gloves on, and a card left on departure. Here's what made it the most important unit. It was where information travelled fastest. The ball produced encounters. The morning call produced assessments. Assessments were what the season's underlying machinery actually ran on. Think about what an encounter produces. Two people in a room together for the duration of a dance or a dinner. Brief, managed, controlled by the occasion's own conventions. An encounter was a unit of impression. An assessment was something deeper. It accumulated over multiple visits. It compared notes across observers. It produced a picture that had texture and specificity. That picture was what the invitation decisions were made on. Not the impression from one evening, the picture built from many mornings. A young woman received callers in her family's drawing room between 10 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. Callers arrived, sat, engaged in pleasant conversation, and then left. On a good morning, the hostess might see anywhere from 3 to 12 callers. The drawing room that received many callers in the early weeks of the season communicated something specific. The drawing room that received fewer communicated something else. Both things were known. Both things were compared. The comparison shaped the invitations that followed. The drawing room itself was prepared for calling days. Flowers were ordered specifically for the calling hours. The room was heated to the expected standard. The chairs were positioned. A drawing room receiving callers was a stage managed to appear natural. The management was not visible. The appearance was the point. The caller left a card on departure. The card system had its own specific logic, and the logic was legible to everyone within it. One card for the mistress of the house, one for each daughter in residence. The number communicated. The angle at which the card was placed communicated. Whether the corner was bent communicated. A bent corner indicated a personal call rather than a servant sent to deposit the card in the holder, without the caller entering the house at all. The difference between a personal call and a delegated card was a difference the receiving household noted and remembered. And then there was the timing, which I find quietly hilarious to think about now. The morning call window ran from 10 to 1. Within that window a hierarchy operated. A call arriving shortly after 10 communicated enthusiasm. A call close to 1 communicated something more measured. The middle of the window was the most neutral choice and the most commonly taken one. And so the game already running between households extended to the precise hour of the call. An hour that encoded attitude, interest and positioning without anyone saying a word about it directly. The caller chose their hour consciously. The receiving household noted the hour. The note joined the other notes the household was already keeping about this caller and their family, and the notes accumulated quietly, visit by visit, hour by hour, through May and June and into July. Here is the thing about this system that I think is genuinely worth stopping on. The information moving through the morning call circuit was never stated directly. It was never necessary to state it directly. The season ran on a shared interpretive framework that everyone within it had been trained to use. Small signals carried large amounts of content. The hour of the call, the number of callers received, whether the drawing room was full or thin on a given Thursday, all of it readable and all of it read. By the time the season was 3 weeks old, the network's picture of any given debutante was already quite specific. It had been built note by note through the call records and the comparative observations of the network. The picture would keep growing richer. But its basic shape had already emerged, and the basic shape influenced the invitation for the private ball. I want to say something precise about what that picture actually was. It was not a judgment about her character. It was not a judgment about her intelligence. It was a picture of her fit to the room, the tone, the other participants, and the expectations of the families who mattered most. The question being formed was not whether she was admirable. The question was whether she was correctly suited to the thing that the season required. The private ball was the largest set piece in the season's calendar, not the public anchor events, which were attended by obligation and offered less room to manoeuvre. The private balls, given in the receiving rooms of the great London houses. The rooms had been built for this purpose, or adapted for it over time. The furniture was moved or removed entirely. The space was cleared. Chairs were arranged around the perimeter. The floor was left open in the centre. An orchestra occupied the far end, and above it, the chandeliers, gas or electric light, depending on the house and the decade, warm and diffuse, spreading across white dresses and dark coats. The light had a quality that everyone present understood was designed. This was a space arranged specifically for display, lit to make display beautiful, attended by people who came knowing they would be watched. She arrived in her ball gown. The gown was the appropriate garment for the occasion. It had been chosen carefully, worn carefully, maintained carefully. The gown communicated as everything communicated. Its freshness, its fabric, its cut, the flowers at the corsage, the ribbon at the waist, each one being read by the room as she crossed from the entrance to her chair. She sat at the edge of the room, her dance card hung at her wrist from a narrow ribbon. Her white gloves, long ones, running past the elbow, were folded over the back of the chair beside her, soft and pale against the dark wood. I keep coming back to that image from the period accounts. A girl at the edge of a ballroom with her gloves folded on the chair beside her. The whole season in miniature. The preparation done. The appearance correct. Waiting for what the room will do next. Everything before this moment was something she could control or prepare for. The room is now the variable, and the room, as we've established, has been watching for weeks. I want to return to that image later, to what she actually wrote about evenings like this one, the private account. But the dance card mechanics come first. The dance card governed the evening. Each dance of the evening was listed on the card in order. Beside each dance, a line for a partner's name and a narrow pencil attached by a second ribbon. Partners would approach before the music for that dance began. A request was made. She agreed or declined. Agreement meant the name was written on the line. The line was claimed. The card was not a private document. It was a document carried on her wrist in a lit room, visible to anyone close enough to see it. A card with every line filled communicated something specific. A card with several empty lines communicated something else. A card with particular names on particular dances communicated things only readable to those who knew which names mattered. Each of these was a different message. Each message was being read simultaneously by different people in the same room. A dance that went unpartnered left a blank line on the card, visible to anyone close enough to see, not invisible. The empty line was a piece of information. Like everything else in the room, it communicated. It communicated that this particular dance, at this particular hour, had not found a claimant, and the room around her knew it. The dance card full meant the evening had gone well in one measurable dimension. The dance card with lines remaining meant the evening had not gone as well as it might. Both were visible. Both were noticed. And what was noticed in the ballroom joined what had been noticed in the morning calls, joined the assessments of the drawing room, joined the picture that was growing richer, call by call, dance by dance, through the weeks of the season. The card also had rules embedded in it that everyone in the room understood. A debutante was not supposed to dance more than 2 dances with the same partner in a single evening. 2 dances was acceptable. It communicated interest without commitment. 3 dances communicated something the room would read as a declaration of preference. A declaration created expectations. Expectations that had not been formally established were a social liability. And so the card was not only a schedule, it was a mechanism for managing the interpretations of a watching room. Managing the dance card was real strategic intelligence. Deciding who to grant which dance and what to signal through each choice required holding multiple simultaneous social calculations. What a given partner's name on a given dance communicated to one observer might mean something different to another. A choice that managed the first impression correctly might create a secondary problem with a second observer. The management had to account for all of these. Managing the interpretations of a watching room, while appearing warm and pleasant to everyone, was exactly what the season required. Making the management appear effortless was part of the requirement. It was being performed in real time, in a lit ballroom with music playing. The dance card was one of the very few instruments the season gave her to manage with genuine agency. And so, it was where a great deal of quiet intelligence went. Now, while reading about this system, I kept returning to one question. Who enforced the rules? The morning call window, the 2-dance limit, the specific street hierarchy, the card bent at the corner, the freshness of the trimming on the gown. None of these appear in any official document. There is no handbook of the London season. Nobody was formally penalised for calling at 12:30 instead of 11. Nobody was publicly excluded from a ball for dancing 3 times with the same partner, and yet the rules operated, reliably, across hundreds of participants, over decades. The enforcement mechanism, when you look carefully at the historical accounts, was the network, not a single enforcer, not a committee with any formal authority. The network itself, the accumulating, comparing, note-sharing network of women who had been navigating this system for years and sometimes decades. The great hostesses who controlled the invitation lists, the mothers seated along the walls of every ball, the callers who noted the state of each drawing room they visited and compared notes with what they'd observed elsewhere. The enforcement was distributed and constant, and it operated through a mechanism that required no announcement. A misstep was observed. The observation was compared with other observations. The comparison produced a picture. The picture influenced the next invitation, the next morning call received, the next ball. The system corrected for deviations without anyone announcing correction. It simply produced slightly fewer invitations. A drawing room that was slightly thinner on Thursday. A silence where previously there had been engagement. Nobody said anything. The correction happened anyway, which, as enforcement mechanisms go, is among the most efficient designs ever produced. It's worth understanding what that silence meant for the person on the receiving end. It arrived without explanation. The invitation simply didn't come. The morning call was simply thinner. The drawing room was simply quieter. There was no statement of the reason, no opportunity to correct a mistake she might not have known she'd made. The correction was complete before she could identify what had required correcting. The person being corrected often wasn't certain whether the correction was happening. It arrived as an absence rather than a statement, as a silence rather than a declaration, as slightly fewer options. The uncertainty was part of the design. A correction that arrives as ambiguity is harder to challenge than a correction that arrives as a rule. She was being judged by a system with no visible judges, governed by rules with no visible author, subject to consequences that arrived quietly and were never formally explained. This is the detail I find hardest to shake about the season. The entire structure rested on an agreement that nobody ever signed. That agreement held reliably and consequentially for decades. It held because the network enforced it by simply being the network, by watching, by comparing, by remembering, and by deciding in a quiet and distributed way what the next invitation would say. Here is what I think is remarkable about this. The network needed no coercion to function. Nobody was compelled to participate. Every participant did so voluntarily, for reasons of their own interest, and in operating voluntarily, they sustained an extraordinarily effective system. It sorted the women who fit from the women who didn't. By the end of the season, the network's assessments had been refined over 4 months of continuous observation. The picture of each participant was detailed and widely shared, and the picture was what the marriage market actually ran on. She sat at the edge of the ballroom, the folded gloves beside her on the chair, the dance card at her wrist, the music beginning, the network in its quiet and distributed way, noting everything it always noted, as it had been noting everything since the morning the trunks came down the stone stairs in April, and as it would continue to note until the last ball was over and the trunks went back. The picture was what the marriage market actually ran on. So let's talk about the market itself. The first thing you need to know is the numbers. Each season in the peak decades of the institution produced somewhere between 700 and 900 new debutantes, 700 to 900 young women entering the season for the first time, all of them operating within a system designed to produce one specific outcome. The number of eligible bachelors was considerably smaller. Not every man who attended season events was eligible by the standards that mattered. Eligible meant available, appropriate in terms of family standing, and in possession of an income sufficient to support a household at the expected standard. Men who met all 3 criteria and who were actively in the market were a much smaller population. The documented estimates varied, but the rough consensus, when you look at the period accounts, was that the ratio was not favourable. The math if you look at it directly, is fairly bleak. More candidates than positions, a structured field with more applicants than outcomes, which means the season, for all its machinery and preparation, produced participants who would not achieve its stated purpose. Those women would return home in autumn with the trunks. The season would have ended, the trunks would go back onto the stairs with a different kind of weight than they came down with. I want to be precise here, because this is a detail that tends to get softened. The season was not primarily a romantic event. It was a sorting mechanism. The romantic version focuses on the dances and the flowers and the letters and the courtship. All of those things existed, but they existed inside a structure that was fundamentally economic, a structure designed to move women with good family connections into households that needed what they brought, and to move them efficiently with appropriate documentation and with the network's endorsement of the transaction. There is a version of this history that presents the marriage market as an unfortunate constraint, one imposed on women who otherwise wanted romance. I don't think that's quite right as a description. Many of the women who participated in the season understood the structure clearly. The accounts they left suggest they were not naive about what the institution was for. They were also not without preference. And the interesting part is this: how much real preference and real intelligence they managed to exercise inside a structure formally designed to limit both. Here's what that actually looked like on the ground. The eligible man who arrived at a ball in May was also making assessments. His network fed him information about the same girls the women's network was discussing. He knew which girls had been presented, he knew which drawing rooms were receiving well, he knew which families were financially sound, and which were hoping the season would solve a problem in time. He had his own picture, assembled from the same morning call information, filtered through his own family's priorities. What he was weighing was specific. First, family. Not just the name, but the reputation of the family within the network. A family with a history of financial difficulty or social missteps carried that history. It entered every negotiation their daughter's name was attached to. Second, income and settlement potential. What did the family have to offer in financial terms? Third, disposition. How she behaved at balls and morning calls. Whether she was warm, steady, appropriate in her manner. Fourth, appearance. Not beauty in any absolute sense, but the kind of appearance that communicated health and household management capacity. What the list does not include, and this is worth saying plainly, is intellectual ambition, personal opinion, or independent ideas. The season's formal evaluation had no column for those qualities. A girl who expressed strong opinions in public was considered poorly managed. A girl who demonstrated unusual intellectual independence was difficult to categorize. The qualities the evaluation was looking for were specific. A woman who would manage a household smoothly, represent the family appropriately, and produce children. Intelligence was welcome if expressed through the management of social situations, not through the expression of views. The season evaluated all 4 criteria simultaneously, and the man was conducting the same evaluation from his side. There is something worth noting about this symmetry. Both sides were operating through the same network. Both sides were making their assessment under the same constraints. The network mediated both directions of information flow, which meant that the network's picture of any given situation was the shared reality both sides were navigating. A girl with a strong position in the network's assessment was not only better placed to attract suitable proposals, she was better placed to evaluate the men who were making them. The network was the advantage that cut both ways. This is, I think, the most interesting structural feature of the season. It was a system designed to limit women's agency. And within that system, the primary tool women used was the same system that was limiting them. The network was simultaneously the constraint and the resource. That is a fairly elegant design if you look at it without sentiment. What the season did not provide structurally was the opportunity to discover each other in private. Privacy was the one thing the system was designed to prevent. She was never alone with him. Not in a drawing room, not at a ball, not in a garden at an afternoon party. She was always in a room with at least one other person present, and usually more. Her mother, her chaperone, the other guests. The season's conventions had been refined over decades to produce exactly this environment. Two people could be in the same room. They could speak. They could observe each other and even develop a genuine preference for each other. But they could never have a conversation that was truly private. The chaperoned conversation was its own art form. Consider what it requires. Two people who wish to communicate something genuine in a room of people listening carefully without appearing to. The content of the conversation had to stay within the season's permitted register. The weather, the music of last evening, whether Ascot had been enjoyable. None of these are the things two genuinely interested people actually want to discuss. And yet they discussed them, because discussing them was all the situation permitted. And within that constrained conversation, a great deal was communicated that was not stated. The tone of a response, the length of a pause before the answer, the quality of attention paid to a question that didn't require much attention. Every instrument the conversation allowed was being used. The chaperone sitting in the corner of the room was also reading the conversation. She was reading it differently from the two people inside it. She was reading for the things the season was designed to protect against. The conversation that moved too quickly toward intimacy. The attention that communicated a level of preference not yet appropriate to the stage of the acquaintance. The chaperone's job was to ensure that whatever was being communicated stayed within the currently sanctioned bounds. She was the room's enforcement mechanism, as constant as the drawing room itself, and then the physical detail I keep returning to. The white gloves were picked up from the hall table before she left for an afternoon call at 3. Soft, buttoned at the wrist. She put them on in the hall, the same way she always put them on. The light coming in through the hall window at 3 in the afternoon was different from the morning light. Lower, warmer, coming at a slight angle. She was going into a drawing room where the same light would be falling across a tea table, and a conversation permitted to be pleasant and required to remain careful. He would be there, with his family or as a visitor to the household. The conversation would be pleasant, careful. The topics would stay within the register. But within the pleasant, careful conversation, both of them would be paying close attention to things that weren't stated, and both of them would know it. And the chaperone sitting across the room would be paying attention to the attention itself. The whole room was a reading exercise. Now, the financial structure underneath all of this was not romantic, and I think it's important to understand it clearly, because the financial structure is what makes the intelligence required of these women genuinely remarkable to me. When a match was made, the formal arrangements that followed were not a wedding plan. They were a legal negotiation. The marriage settlement was a document. It was negotiated between the bride's family and the groom's family, usually through their respective lawyers. It was negotiated before the engagement was publicly announced. The settlement specified several things. First, the jointure, the income she would receive annually if she was widowed. This was the primary financial protection a married woman held. In a world where she could not independently hold property, The jointure was everything. The jointure was negotiated carefully. A low jointure was a vulnerability she would carry for the rest of her married life. Second, the pin money, her annual allowance for personal expenses within the marriage. Third, any dowry or settlement her family was providing and the conditions under which it would transfer. These negotiations happened between men about women in offices she was not present in. The woman herself had almost no formal role in the negotiation of her own financial future. She might be consulted by a sympathetic father, she might not. The outcome was determined by the negotiating positions of the two families and how much each side wanted the match. The women who negotiated well were the women who arrived with clear information about what good terms looked like. The ones who knew, before the conversation began, what a reasonable jointure was and what a low one looked like. Who knew which families were known to negotiate fairly and which were known to negotiate hard. That information was part of the network's knowledge base. It circulated through the drawing rooms in the same way everything else did, quietly, indirectly, reliably. Information about settlements did circulate. Women who had been through the process talked about it in the drawing room language of the season. Not directly. Nothing in the season was stated directly. But a woman who had recently concluded a settlement knew things that a girl about to enter negotiations did not. And that knowledge passed, in the way all season knowledge passed, through the call visits and the drawing rooms, through the quiet observations shared between women who'd been navigating the same system for different lengths of time. Consider what that required of her. She had to present herself appropriately within the marriage market's conventions, managing her appearance and her manner and her dance card and her morning calls, all the machinery of the surface, and simultaneously she had to assess the men she was meeting, accurately enough to make a decision she would live with for the rest of her life, in a situation where the decision once made was very difficult to reverse. She couldn't ask him directly about his finances. The conversation didn't permit it. She couldn't spend time alone with him to assess his character in any unmanaged way. The season prevented it. She couldn't consult a lawyer about the settlement terms. The convention didn't include her in that room. What she had was the network. The same network that had been observing her was also collecting information about him. A girl with good contacts could know a great deal about a man before the engagement was confirmed, his financial position, his family's history, his known habits, the reputation of his household management. The network, used well, was an extraordinarily powerful tool. It was one of the few the formal structures gave her. She could decline. That was her most significant formal instrument. The power to say no. She couldn't initiate, she couldn't pursue, she couldn't renegotiate the terms of the conversation, but she could, when a proposal arrived, decline it. A girl with good information was in a much better position to use that decline wisely, better than a girl who had operated only within the season's formal surface. The dance card was part of this. The specific names she had placed on specific dances over the preceding weeks had been a form of communication. Communication to the network, which was watching. Communication to the men themselves who were interpreting, and communication to herself. About which names, when she looked at the card in the carriage afterward, carried the right kind of weight. The card was a record of a preference forming. The preference had formed under observation, in constrained conditions with limited information, and she had to trust it enough to act on it or decline and live with whichever she chose. That is the season's underlying demand. Not the curtsy, not the gown, not the 5 hours in the carriage. The underlying demand was this. A woman entering the season had to make a significant decision about her life's direction, under conditions of incomplete information, in public, with limited time. using whatever intelligence she could gather through channels that were never designed to tell her everything she needed to know, and she had to make that decision while appearing at every visible moment, warm and pleasant and entirely at ease. The trunks would go back in August. The season would end. The girls who went back to the country took with them either a signed settlement or the intention to return. Both outcomes were entirely possible going into any given season, and both were common. All of that machinery, all of that systemic description, was experienced by actual people. I want to tell you about some of them. There is a quality that the diaries and letters of this period have. It strikes me every time I read them. The women who wrote these documents were doing two things at once. They were living inside the season's system, managing its demands, performing its requirements, and they were also observing themselves doing that. The letters and diaries carry a particular kind of double consciousness, noticing and performing both at the same time. The person inside the experience and the person watching the person inside the experience, both active and both present. A young woman describing a ball would, in the same paragraph, describe the dance she enjoyed, and then add a detail so precisely placed. The whole social context becomes visible to anyone who knows how to read it. She would describe a morning call with apparently casual warmth, and then, in two more sentences, place the morning's social significance precisely. The observation is the telling part. The letters are full of it. Let me give you a sense of the scale. The letters of the season's participants are not short documents. A full season might produce 100 letters to a single correspondent. Some of the most vivid accounts were written in letters of several pages, written almost every day. Across the course of a full season, that is a substantial body of work, and the consistency of observation across those letters is what I find remarkable. The same quality of attention, the same dry precision, the same warmth, maintained across 4 months of exhausting performance, not because they were performing the observation, because the observation was simply how they were. This is what makes the private documents of the season more interesting than the official records. The official record of a presentation, as published in the court circular, typically ran to approximately 40 words. It told you who was presented, in what order, and to whom. The personal account of the same event, written in a diary within 24 hours, typically ran to 400. The diary told you what she noticed about the woman standing in front of her in the queue, what she thought about the feathers, what she felt in the carriage on the way home, when the 30 seconds of performance had passed. The official record is the skeleton. The diary is the person. The women who left these accounts were clearly intelligent, moving through the season's conventions and alongside them, noticing things the conventions were not designed to reward, writing those observations down in letters to sisters and friends, and in diaries, which were the one space in the season's social architecture where the convention could be set aside, where something closer to the truth could be recorded without consequence. Lady Frederick Cavendish kept a diary across the years of her season and beyond. She wrote with a warmth and a sharpness that sit together in a way you'd recognize immediately. She was fond of the people she liked. She was precise about the people she found difficult. She described the social machinery around her with a clarity that suggests she understood exactly what the machinery was doing, while she was inside it. That kind of understanding is not a passive quality. It required attention and honesty, neither of which the season formally asked for. There is a detail in her diary that I find particularly telling. She would often record a morning's callers not just in terms of who came, but the atmosphere they left behind, the fullness of the room, the quality of the conversation after they left. The diary tracks the circuit not as a list of names, but as an assessment of what the names represented. That is a sophisticated analytical act, performed every morning, recorded every evening, over the course of an entire season, and simultaneously she understood the structure those events were built on, with a precision she was careful never to express in the drawing rooms. Cynthia Asquith wrote about her season in terms that have the same quality. She was observant of the performance required and observant of what the performance cost. Her accounts of balls and morning calls have a texture that is both sincere and wry. She was not cynical about the season. She was clear about it, which is a different thing and probably harder to sustain. Across several months in rented London accommodation with a full social calendar, the weight Asquith conveys most powerfully is not the weight of any individual occasion, but the cumulative weight was different. Performing the correct version of yourself at every ball, every morning call, every dinner, from April through July, the sustained performance. The diary is where the weight of it is recorded. And reading it now, the weight is palpable in a way the formal accounts never quite capture. And then there was Lady Diana Manners, who would later become Lady Diana Cooper. Her memoir provides some of the most vivid accounts of what the season felt like from the inside. She was not a typical debutante in temperament. She knew it. And she wrote about it with a self-aware humour that requires genuine intelligence to produce. Her accounts of balls and presentations and morning calls have the quality of someone who was genuinely enjoying herself, while also being entirely clear-eyed about what the enjoyment was in service of. She was, by several accounts, exceptional in the season's terms, beautiful, well-connected, lively. And yet what her memoir communicates most clearly is not triumph but thoughtful observation. She was watching herself move through the machinery in a way that suggests she found the machinery itself genuinely interesting, which is itself a particular kind of intelligence. I find these accounts moving in the particular way that I find evidence of intelligence exercised under constraint moving. Here were women who were, by the season's formal logic, supposed to be pleasant and carefully managed. And here is what they actually were, in the spaces where they were permitted to speak freely. They were funny, they were sharp, they noticed things, they had opinions. They expressed preferences with the directness that the season's drawing rooms would never have permitted. I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this observation that romanticizes a genuinely constrained situation. The private documents show us women who were more interesting than their public roles permitted. They do not show us women who were free. The constraint was real. The consequences of performing badly within it were real. And the intelligence on display in the diaries is intelligence exercised within severe limits. But within those limits, real thinking was happening. Real observation was being made. Real preferences were forming, and those preferences had real consequences, even if they could only be expressed through carefully managed channels. The gap between the public performance and the private record is the emotional heart of this history for me. The season required a particular kind of public self. The diaries and letters show a private self that was considerably more interesting. And the fact that these women maintained both, simultaneously, across months of sustained performance, is something I keep thinking about. The managed performance and the honest observation, both happening at once, both being carried at the same time. The writing desk was the one piece of furniture in most season households that was entirely personal. The drawing rooms were social. The dining room was formal. The bedroom was practically the only truly private space. The writing desk was the exception. Before the calling began, or after the last ball, this was where something actually true could be written. She sat at the writing desk. The letter to her sister was in front of her. The sister was not yet out, was still in the country, asking about the season. The white gloves were on the desk beside the inkwell, not on her hands. Laid down when she came in from the evening, the way things get set down when you're finally done with them for the night. The letter she was writing was warm. It was funny in places. She described the dress of a particular ball. Her description had a precision that was partly an eye for fabric and partly coded social commentary. She described a dance with a man whose name had appeared on her card several times across 2 different evenings. She noted this without stating what it meant or what she thought about it. She described the drawing room of a particular Thursday, which had been notably full, and the drawing room of the following Tuesday, which had been notably less so. She left the contrast to speak for itself. She hadn't put the dance card away yet. She had read it several times since coming home. Not because she needed to. She knew the names, but because reading it let her think about what the names meant in sequence, with the evening's context still clear. The man whose name appeared most often had not said anything that would have concerned a chaperone. He had said things that, in context, said a great deal. She had heard the things in context. She was thinking about what to do with a hearing. She didn't write that she was being evaluated by a network she could only partially see, using criteria she was never formally told, with an outcome that would shape the rest of her life. She didn't write that she was managing the interpretations of a watching room while appearing entirely at ease. She didn't write any of that. The season had given her a language for the surface, and she used it beautifully. But near the end of the letter, she wrote something that stays with me. That it was not quite what she had expected, but that she was learning what it actually was. That sentence does a great deal of work in very few words, which is, I think, the particular skill the season produced in the women who passed through it. The ability to say something true, clearly, within severe constraints, without appearing to have said anything at all. That is not an accident. That is the skill, fully deployed. The humour version of this observation is also worth making. The entire letter contained almost nothing that couldn't have been read aloud at a morning call, without causing any social discomfort whatsoever. And yet, to someone who understood the season, the letter was extremely informative about her state of mind, about the specific people who had captured her attention, about the degree to which the management was holding, and the places where it was slightly less easy than it looked. The letter said almost nothing. The letter said quite a lot. That was the skill running in both directions simultaneously. The machinery was already running. It had been running since April. It would continue to run until August. And when August came, the households packed up. The morning calls stopped. The dance cards were put away. The trunks went back onto the stairs, down into the carriages, and back to the country. Some of those women went back without a match. They went back with the knowledge and with the intention of returning. A second season was not unusual. A third was less common but not impossible. Each season built on the previous one. The network's picture was updated but not erased. What you had done in the previous season was known. What you had decided and not decided was part of the picture the next April would begin with. A woman returning for a second season was returning with a clearer sense of the field, and usually a clearer sense of her own priorities within it, and the network would reconvene in April, as it had the year before and would the year after, with new debutantes to assess and new pictures to build, and with the same white gloves pressed and ready, Waiting for the next morning, the trunks came down. By June or July, those same girls were experienced navigators. They had understood the system in theory, and now understood it in practice. The theory and the practice were not the same thing. They never are. But by July, the gap between them had closed considerably. Inside all of that, a real person had been writing a letter to her sister, somewhere in a rented house in London, making it warm and funny and careful and informative all at the same time, with the gloves laid down beside the inkwell and the dance card not yet put away. I find it all genuinely tender when I stop looking at the machinery and look at the person inside it. The tenderness is not about the constraints. I am not moved by the constraints. What I find moving is what was happening inside them, the observation, the dry humour, the letter that said almost nothing and said quite a lot, the dance card not yet put away, the gloves beside the inkwell, and someone sitting at a writing desk after a long evening of managing all of it, writing something warm and true to her sister. The machinery was extraordinary in its design. The person navigating it was more extraordinary still. The season would end, and it would begin again, and the machinery would keep running. But every time I read these letters and diaries, what I come back to is the same thing. Not the machinery, the person inside it, writing warmly and truly, late in the evening, to someone who hadn't been there yet and wanted to know what it was like. And then the season ended. It ended the same way it ended every year, on the 12th of August. The glorious 12th, as it was known, was not a season event. It was the first day of grouse shooting season, but it functioned with remarkable precision as the season's closing bell. The great households of the aristocracy departed for Scotland. The grouse were waiting. The London drawing rooms were left to the servants and the dust covers, and the debutantes, matched or unmatched, went home. I find the timing genuinely funny. It says something specific about the culture. The season ran from April to August. The elaborate machinery of morning calls and presentations and dance cards ran its full course, and it ended because the birds in Scotland were ready to be shot. This season ran from spring to the glorious 12th. That is the whole calendar. That is the whole system. There is a term that contemporary observers used for the particular feeling of the season's final days. They called it the scramble. The last 2 weeks of July had a quality that everyone who had been through the season recognised. Events stacked on top of each other. Last balls, last race meetings, last opportunities for the dance card and the conversation, and the drawing room assessment. The pace increased rather than slowing, and then, on the 12th, it stopped. Not gradually, completely. The season did not taper off. It had a hard stop on a specific date, after which nothing further was possible, nothing further was required. You were either done or you were returning next April. Either way, you were leaving. Let me describe what the departure looked like in practice. The household that had taken weeks to set up in April was dismantled in a matter of days. The grouse did not wait. The trains to Scotland did not accommodate extensive second thoughts. The household machinery that had supported the season ran in reverse with remarkable efficiency. Things went back where they came from. The borrowed furniture was returned. The rented house reverted to its minimal staff. The flowers were not ordered, and the window at the front of the house went dark. The window that had been lit on ball nights with a particular intentionality. In August it went dark with an equal intentionality. The August light in London was different from the May light. Less bright, lower angle, The city had that particular quality it gets in late summer, when the people who fill it have gone somewhere else. The morning room no longer received. The drawing room was covered. The whole household that had been calibrated for performance was being recalibrated quickly and practically for absence. That contrast gives the season's physical evidence its particular quality. The house in May and the house in August, the same rooms, the same furniture, or close to it, the same light through the same windows at the same angle. But the difference between the two was total. In May, the drawing room was the site of morning calls, of network assessments, of the season's constant evaluation. It was a working room. It had a function, and it performed that function every day from 11 until 4. In August it was covered, the furniture wrapped, the curtains drawn. The function had ended completely. The room was still the same room. But the thing the room was for had stopped, and you could feel that stopping in the quality of the August silence, and that quality was specific. It was not the silence of a room that had always been quiet. It was the silence of a room that had recently been filled with morning callers and assessments and the careful maintenance of the season's conventions, and was now empty of all of those things. The absence had a texture. It was made of the thing that had just been there. The trunks went back up the stairs. The process reversed itself with the same efficiency as the original arrival. The drawing-room dresses were folded. The ball gowns were wrapped and packed with appropriate materials. A ball gown had been worn once or twice at most, commissioned, fitted, adjusted and worn in front of rooms of people who were making assessments. And it was now being folded away. The gown worn to the ball where the name appeared on the card, folded, wrapped, in the trunk. There is something about the specific detail of a ball gown folded into a trunk that stays with me. It was, objectively, a piece of fabric. Expensive fabric, well made, carefully chosen. But the fabric had done something. It had been worn in a room where assessments were being made. It had been part of the presentation, and now it was folded away. The season was in the trunks, going back to the country. The gowns and the gloves and the dance cards and the knowledge and the outcomes. And at the bottom of one of the trunks under the heavier things were the white gloves, wrapped in a square of tissue, folded at the bottom, the way things get packed when you're done with them for a while, when you know you'll need them again in April. The dance card was in the small compartment at the side of the trunk, where the personal things went, the names on it, from the final ball of the season still legible. The dance card would stay in the compartment until April, when the whole procedure began again and a new card would replace it. But for now, it was in the compartment, with the names on it. The leaving had its own particular quality, different from the arrival in April. For the women who had made a match, the quality of the leaving was relief. The season had produced its intended outcome. The settlement was agreed or in process. The trunks went back up the stairs carrying the resolution of 4 months of assessment and performance and constrained conversation. The thing was done. The gloves had done their work. What that actually meant in practical terms was that the work was only beginning. Marriage was not the conclusion of the story. It was the beginning of a different story. The same network that had observed her as a debutante would now observe her as a wife. The drawing room would now be hers to manage. A woman who had been successfully assessed by the network became, through marriage, a woman who helped assess others. She knew the system from the inside. She had navigated it, made the decisions it asked of her, and produced an outcome the network endorsed. She'd entered the system as its subject. She was now, in part, its instrument. The transition was efficient. It had to be. The season's machinery required a constant supply of experienced participants. Women who had been successfully matched provided the drawing rooms where the next cohort of debutantes would be received. Women who had been through the evaluation process knew what the evaluation process was looking for, and they applied that knowledge in the drawing rooms they now managed. The network grew through its own outcomes. Each match created a new node in the assessment apparatus. For the women who had not made a match, the quality of the leaving was different. The season had passed. The assessment had been made for 4 months by a network they could only partially see, and the outcome had not arrived. They were going back to the country. They would return next April. The network's picture of them was updated and waiting. A second season was not the end of anything. It was a continuation of a process that had not yet concluded. But the trunks going back up the stairs carried something real. The knowledge of how the machine worked, now grounded in practice, not theory. They went by carriage first, and then by train, to the country house, where the light was different, where the days were longer and less scheduled, where the drawing room was the family's and not a stage for a structured performance. And then April came again. New trunks came down the stairs, new gowns commissioned from the dressmakers on Regent Street, new dance cards, blank, waiting, new presentations to be scheduled and practiced. The network that had spent August in Scotland was reconvening in London for the new season. It brought its accumulated knowledge, its updated picture of the field, its memory of who had been presented and what the network had concluded about them. The picture was updated. It was never erased. The season had a long memory, and that memory grew with each new cohort that passed through it. Now, I want to tell you when it ended, permanently. The ending says as much about the institution as its origins do. The London season, in the form described in this script, ended officially in 1958. Not because it ran out of participants, not because it had lost most of its original purpose. It ended because Queen Elizabeth II made a specific decision. She announced that formal court presentations of debutantes would cease. After 1958, young women would no longer be formally presented at court. The court drawing room had been the season's anchoring ritual for well over 100 years. It was abolished by royal decree. The reason the palace gave was interesting. Court presentations had become, by the 1950s, available to a much wider circle than the traditional aristocracy and gentry. American heiresses were being presented through sponsors. Wealthy women from families with no meaningful connection to the original social network were moving through the ceremony. The presentation had become, in the palace's assessment, insufficiently selective. The solution was abolition, not reform, not a tightening of the criteria. Abolition. It is worth pausing on this. The season was not a trivial institution. It had operated continuously, with adjustments, for more than 100 years. It had survived the Napoleonic Wars, the Victorian expansion, and the deaths of 2 monarchs. It had adapted to the changing financial landscape of the 19th century, when new money from trade began to press against the gates. And it had managed that adaptation by becoming more selective, not less. But it could not survive the mid-20th century in any meaningful form. By 1958, the mechanism was so far from its original function that the palace could end it with apparent ease. That is its own kind of historical statement. After 1958, a season of social events continued to exist. Balls, race meetings, garden parties, Ascot, Henley, cows. The calendar of events did not disappear overnight, but the institutional machinery was gone. What remained was the social calendar without the formal structure underneath it, the parties without the sorting mechanism, the events without the evaluation apparatus that had given the events their original function. What did not go away was the skill the season produced, the management of public performance, the reading of social signals, the double consciousness, the noticing and the performing at the same time, the ability to say something true within severe constraints without appearing to have said anything at all. The season had refined these skills over 4 months of intensive application. The women who came out of it were different from the women who went in. That difference was real and it lasted, and the season would not have had those women if it had not also had the constraint. The diaries lasted too, the letters, the private records, Lady Frederick Cavendish's diary, Cynthia Asquith's accounts, Lady Diana Cooper's memoirs. These documents exist because the season created a situation in which a very specific kind of observation was necessary. The management of the surface was so demanding that it required a corresponding space, where the surface could be set down, where the actual observation could be recorded. The season produced the constraint. The constraint produced the record. And the record is how we know what the constraint felt like from the inside. It is worth noting what the season was not designed to do. It was not designed to produce self-reflection in its participants. Self-reflection was not a valued quality within the season's formal register. A woman who appeared to be observing the machinery critically was not demonstrating anything the machinery rewarded. She was demonstrating something the machinery was, at best, indifferent to. And yet the self-reflection happened, privately, in the one space it could happen. And because it happened there, the evidence exists. Because the constraint produced the relief, and the relief produced the documentation. And the season produced an extraordinary body of evidence about what it felt like to be a woman in the 19th century, navigating severe constraints with real intelligence. Evidence that has survived the season by more than a century. Evidence the season's designers never intended to exist. The institutions that produce the richest evidence of their own nature rarely intended to produce that evidence. The season was designed to be performed from the inside, not documented from the inside, and the performance was so demanding that the women inside it required a private space, where it could be set down. And in that private space they documented it, with warmth and humour and dry precision, and a quality of attention the season's official structure never asked for. The white gloves, folded at the bottom of the trunk, under the heavier things, ready for April. That is what I keep coming back to. Not the institution's design, not its efficiency, not even its eventual abolition. The person inside it. The observation running alongside the performance. The letter to the sister that said quite a lot while appearing to say almost nothing. And the gloves in the trunk, waiting. There is a version of the London season that you have almost certainly encountered. You have seen it on screen. You have read it in novels. It has a particular aesthetic. Ball gowns in pale silk, candles in silver candelabra. A dance card consulted with coy anticipation. A young man across the room whose eye is caught and held for precisely the right amount of time. Music, movement, the slow progress toward a declaration that changes everything. It is a beautiful version. Before I say what it gets wrong, let me say what it gets right. The season was genuinely beautiful in a visual sense. The balls were elaborate, the clothes were extraordinary. The drawing rooms of Mayfair were well furnished and lit carefully. The music at a good ball was genuinely enjoyable. The flowers ordered twice a week for the drawing room were described, in the period accounts, with real pleasure. The pleasures of the season were real pleasures. The romantic version captures that. It does not invent the beauty. The beauty was there. There is a specific kind of historical entertainment that takes a real institution and removes its difficulties, while keeping the things that made it visually appealing. That is a completely reasonable thing to do, and the season is an ideal candidate for it. The visual vocabulary is extraordinary. The events have a clear structure. The social hierarchy provides conflict, and the rituals, the presentation, the ball, the morning call provide scene settings that are historically specific and aesthetically rich. The romantic version works, as entertainment, precisely because the season provided such good, well-documented raw material for it. The raw material was extraordinary. The institution was made for this kind of storytelling, but the default image most people carry has several features that do not match how the institution actually worked, and the gap between the image and the reality is, I think, genuinely interesting. Because the gap says something about what we want the season to have been, and what it actually was. The first thing the romantic version gets wrong is the dance card. In the romantic version, the dance card is an object of anticipation. A young woman holds it, hoping for a specific name. A young man approaches and writes his name with a particular intention. The card is the mechanism of romance. The dance it records is the opportunity for meaningful connection in a crowded room. It is a prop in a love story. In reality, the dance card was a management tool. It was a management tool in two directions. In the direction of the girl's reputation. The number of dances given to any single man communicated information to the room. That information affected the network's assessment. Requesting specific dances communicated to the network that he was assessing this particular person with seriousness. The dance card was, as I described earlier, a two-way communication instrument, operating simultaneously in both directions, being read by a room full of observers who are drawing conclusions from what they saw. That is not a love story instrument. That is a network signaling instrument. It could produce love. It could also produce a match with someone the girl was indifferent to, or anxious about, or genuinely enthusiastic about for reasons that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with his financial position. This is the thing that the romantic version tends to simplify, not because the people who make it don't know the economics were there, but because the economics complicate the emotional logic of the romance. If she is assessing him partly for his income, the love story becomes more complicated, a more honest kind. But the romantic version wants the love story to be the thing that exists above the machinery, not inside it. The dance card was neutral about those outcomes. It was not designed to produce any particular kind of feeling. It was designed to communicate and to record. In the fictional versions, the white gloves are often the scene where something meaningful happens. The glove dropped on the ballroom floor. The glove refused. The glove handed across a significant distance. The glove is a prop. It carries meaning assigned to it by the scene it is in. The writers intuitively understand that the physical object that moved between hands was freighted with significance. So the object becomes the scene's instrument. That is good storytelling. It is not, however, the glove's original function. The second thing the romantic version gets wrong is the nature of the observation in the ballroom. In the romantic version, the ballroom is a space of social pleasure that occasionally produces meaningful glances. The other guests are a backdrop. The important action is between the two people in the romantic foreground. In reality, the ballroom was a working environment. Every person in it was engaged in some form of assessment or being assessed. The chaperones were working, the mothers were working, the girls were working, the men were working. The network was running in real time, collecting information, comparing pictures, updating assessments. The pleasure was real. But the pleasure and the work were happening at the same time. The ballroom was not a backdrop, it was the field. The third thing the romantic version gets wrong is what the season was primarily for. The romantic version presents the season as being primarily for love. The economic machinery, if it is acknowledged at all, is presented as a constraint on love, something to be overcome. The romance subverts the machinery. And the romance is better than the machinery. That is the story's moral. In reality, the season was primarily for the movement of capital and connection between families. Love was a potential byproduct, a welcome one, but it was not the mechanism's purpose, and a woman who entered the season hoping primarily for love was operating from a different framework, a significantly different one from the framework the institution was built on. Jane Austen, of all the writers who engaged with this world, understood this the most clearly. Her novels are, at one level, love stories. At another level, they are extremely precise analyses of the economic machinery the season ran on. In Pride and Prejudice, Austen ensures the reader knows Darcy's income, his estate, and his standing in the network. The romance happens in clear economic light. Austen does not pretend the economics are irrelevant to the romance. She presents both, fully, at the same time. Austen's economic precision is not incidental to her novels. It is not there to provide background colour. It is there because Austen understood that the economics were the story. The economics determined which men a woman could realistically consider and which she could not. They determined which matches the network would endorse and which it would resist. They determined the consequence of marrying well versus poorly, and they were not separate from the feeling. The economics shaped the feeling. A woman who married a man with a secure income felt differently about the future than a woman who married a man without one. The difference was not abstract. It was the quality of the jointure, the pin money, the household she could maintain. Austen understood this. Her novels are love stories that contain very precise economic analyses. And when she presents both, the love story becomes more interesting than it would be without the economics, not less. The constraints are not obstacles to the romance. They are the conditions under which the romance is tested, and what the romance survives to become, on the other side of those conditions, is what makes it worth reading, and why it has lasted. The women Austen writes about are not romantic heroines in the simple sense. They are women with intelligence and preference, and real information about the specific network they are operating in. And they make choices inside that network, informed by both their feelings and their accurate assessment of the circumstances. The combination is what makes them so compelling, not the feelings alone, the feelings in informed context. And the context is precise. This is why Austen's novels have survived so well, I think. Not because the romance is beautiful, though it is, but because the romance is presented in a context documented with real accuracy. When you read Austen, you are reading someone who understood the mechanism and chose to tell love stories anyway, knowing that the love stories happened inside a machine, and showing you both the love story and the machine simultaneously. The adaptations often lose the machine. They keep the dresses and the drawing rooms and the dance cards and the glances across the ballroom, but they lose the precision of the economic analysis that gave the original stories their particular tension. The tension in Austen is not just romantic tension. It is the tension between what a person wants and what the mechanism that organizes their world will permit. Remove the mechanism, and you remove the tension. What remains is the dresses and the glances. This is not a criticism of the adaptations. It is an observation about what adaptation requires. When you move a story to screen, the mechanism that creates original tension often does not translate directly. The economic stakes that Austen's readers understood without explanation require significant context for a modern audience, and significant context interrupts narrative momentum, so the adaptations simplify. They keep the surface and the romance and the emotional logic. They trust the audience to feel the stakes because the characters are feeling them. That is a reasonable strategy. It is not the same thing as Austen, but it is not pretending to be Austen. It is a different thing, made from the same material. Now there are more recent fictional treatments that have revived popular interest in the season. These treatments are often beautiful, inventive, and deliberately anachronistic. They know they are not documentaries. They use the season's visual vocabulary as a setting for stories interested in other things, and that is a valid creative choice. What is interesting, though, is what these treatments keep and what they discard. They tend to keep the visual surface in considerable detail. The gowns are researched, the events are named correctly, the dance cards appear, the presentations happen, the social hierarchy is present. But the economic machinery that gave those surfaces their original function tends to be simplified, and the girls are smarter and more independent than the season's formal structure permitted, which is not wrong as a creative choice. It is a deliberate one. The writers are giving the women agency that the season denied them, because the writers are not making a documentary. They are making entertainment. And the entertainment is better for a modern audience with more agency in it. But here is what I find interesting about that choice. The real women of the season were already more independent than the formal structure permitted, not in the ways that fiction shows. They were not defying conventions in public. They were observing and managing and navigating in private, in the spaces the convention couldn't reach. The actual agency was subtler, smaller, more real. The dance card and the morning call and the network intelligence and the private record. The ability to decline, the double consciousness, the writing desk, the letter to the sister. None of those things make for a strong third act scene, but they were real. They required real intelligence, and they were exercised continuously across 4 months of sustained performance. The white gloves in the fictional version are a costume detail, a beautiful one. They are part of the period aesthetic. They communicate elegance and social position. In the documented reality, the white gloves were picked up from the hall table before the morning call at 11. Soft, buttoned at the wrist. They were part of the working uniform of a system requiring sustained performance from April to August. They were not a costume detail. They were a working garment. And the person who put them on every morning was doing something specific and demanding and intelligent, without anyone at the time noting that what she was doing was particularly impressive. The romantic version of the season is enjoyable, and it has kept the season alive in popular imagination, which is its own kind of value. Without the romantic version, fewer people would know what a court presentation was, or what a debutante was, or what the dance card was for. The romantic version is a point of entry. There is a version of the season you come to first, and a version you come to second. The version you come to first is beautiful and enjoyable and enough. The version you come to second, if you go looking, is more interesting. It has the morning call circuit running in real time, distributing information simultaneously, It has the chaperone reading the conversation from the corner of the room. It has the dance card as a two-way signalling instrument interpreted by a watching room. It has the woman at the writing desk late in the evening, writing a letter that said quite a lot while appearing to say almost nothing. The second version is more interesting. Not more enjoyable necessarily, but considerably more interesting. And, if I can be honest about it, the second version is also more respectful. More respectful of the people inside the institution, because it takes the difficulty seriously. It does not remove the difficulty and keep only the pleasure. It looks at what the difficulty actually required, and that is the more interesting version of events. The thing from the inside was more interesting, and considerably more demanding, and the women who navigated it were not romantic heroines in the fictional sense. They were something better than that. They were real people, doing a specific and demanding thing with real intelligence, in public, without appearing to. The season ended the way it began, with a sound, not the sound of trunks coming down, the sound of trunks going up. In late July, Parliament rose. That was the signal. The political calendar and the social season ran together on the same people in the same city. When Parliament rose, the season was over. The great houses closed. The drawing rooms went dark. The flowers were not replaced when they wilted. The staff was reduced. London, in August, became a different city. It happened quickly. That was one of its stranger qualities. A city that had been running at the highest possible intensity for 4 months simply stopped. The streets that had been impassable with carriages in June were quiet by the first week of August. The houses on the best streets, which had been blazing with light every evening in May, had their shutters closed. The drawing rooms were dark and still. The card trays beside the front doors sat empty. No callers were coming. No one was home to receive them. London in August had a specific quality of quiet. Not the quiet of a place that had always been this way. The quiet of a place that knew what it had been in June, and knew that June was over. I think about that particular quality of silence. The flowers not replaced when they wilted. That specific detail from the accounts. The wilting flowers staying in the vases because nobody was ordering new ones, because the household was packing, because the carriage was being prepared to go the other direction. In May, the carriage had gone toward something, toward the court presentation and the drawing rooms and the morning call circuit and the balls, toward the network and the assessment and the evaluation. The wheels on the London cobblestones had been going towards something with a name and a purpose. In late July, the carriage went the other direction. The trunks came back up from the servants' rooms where they had been stored through June. They smelled different now, not cedar and preservation and careful storage. They smelled of use, of 4 months of Mayfair air and pressed gowns, and the particular accumulation of a season lived inside them. The tissue paper that had kept things smooth was no longer crisp. The gowns that went back in had been worn, seen, assessed. They had done the work they were bought to do. Now they were going back into the trunks, back into storage. The season was over. The assessment had run its full course. The verdict had been delivered or it had not. Either way, the carriage was going home. The girl who'd been asked understood the verdict immediately. She did not have to wait for the season to end to know it. The announcement in the Times came first, a brief entry in the engagements column, her name and his name together in print. That was the signal the social world read. And the social world adjusted to it completely and at once. The morning call circuit, which had been running its assessment of her for 4 months, stopped assessing. She was no longer a candidate, she was an outcome, and outcomes were treated very differently from candidates. The calling cards that came after the announcement were warmer in tone. The invitations were different in character. The women who had been evaluating her in May were, by August, congratulating her. The evaluation was over. She had moved from the pool of women being measured to the smaller group found to meet the standard. The practical machinery of the engagement began immediately. There were calls to make and calls to receive. There was a trousseau to be negotiated and assembled. There was the formal meeting between families to be managed. The solicitors would be involved. The marriage settlement had to be worked through carefully. The numbers and the properties and the income provisions, all of it moving forward, efficiently and without sentiment toward the wedding. She had, by any measure that the season recognized, succeeded. 4 months of preparation and performance and assessment had produced the result the machinery was designed to produce. She'd navigated the drawing rooms and the ballrooms and the morning call circuit. She'd managed the surface well enough for long enough. The right person had asked the right question. She had said yes. The season had done its job. The trousseau was a different kind of machinery. It had its own timeline and its own specific requirements. There were linen sheets to be counted and monogrammed. There was the question of silver, of china, of the right household items. Dressmakers were engaged for the wedding gown and the going-away dress, and the half-dozen morning dresses appropriate to a married woman of her station. The measurements taken for the ball gowns were taken again, now for different purposes. Not to be displayed in a ballroom, to be worn in the context of a settled life. The letters from this period have a different tone than the season letters, less managed, less concerned with impression. The assessment was over. She could write now without the dual track. She was still being observed, but the observation had changed its character. She was no longer being evaluated for fitness. She was being welcomed into a specific place. The letters from the engaged period are warmer, less careful. The surface she had maintained for 4 months could be slightly relaxed, not abandoned, but relaxed. And the relaxation shows in the writing. The sentences are a little longer, the observations a little more direct. She had, for the first time in 4 months, slightly more room. She sat in the carriage going back to the country house, and the season was behind her. Something was ahead, something with a name and a date and an address. The other carriage went the same direction, down the same roads, through the same late July city, but for a different reason. She had not been asked. That was the entire fact of it. No entry in the Times, no change in the tone of the morning calls, no formal announcement. The assessment had run for 4 months, and it had concluded without producing the outcome it was designed to produce. The network had decided something. It had not found it necessary to say what. The verdict existed in the absence of the question, in the silence where the question was supposed to be. I said early in this story that I would come back to her, the girl who had gone through the machinery and come out the other side with 2 empty seasons behind her. Now a third was ahead. The season had produced for her not a result but a continuation of the process. The assessment had not concluded. It had simply paused for the summer. It would resume in April, in the same drawing rooms, with the same network. With 3 seasons now on the record instead of 2. What her life became was a quieter thing than what the season had prepared her for. The life that did not follow from a match was, in practical terms, a managed life, a useful one. She was likely to live in her family's house for some years. She would be present at family occasions. She would be useful in specific and recognized ways. She would run the household when her mother was unwell. She would be a steady, known presence at the dinner table when guests came. The life contracted quietly around her, not dramatically, not with anyone saying anything unkind. The contraction was simply what happened when the season did not produce its intended outcome. The life that remained was real, and it was lived. But it was narrower. It had fewer rooms than the one the season had been preparing for. The carriage went back to the country house. The trunks were unloaded. The gowns were put away. The white gloves went back in their tissue paper. Lady Cynthia Charteris wrote about the end of the season with a very specific quality of relief. Not the relief of something good happening, the relief of something stopping. She described the country house in August as the first place where she could stop performing, not stop performing for the season's machinery specifically, stop performing in the most general sense, stop being watched, stop managing the surface, stop holding the public track and the private track simultaneously. The country house in August was somewhere she could simply be present, without that presence being information about her. The garden in August had its own quality. She wrote about it in terms I find quietly telling. The garden was at its peak in late summer, everything grown out, everything in the particular fullness of a thing that has reached its season and is now simply resting in it. Nothing pressing, no calendar obligation hanging over the afternoon. The afternoons were long and unpressured in a way the previous 4 months had made almost impossible to believe in. She could sit in the garden and not be assessed. The garden did not have opinions about her. The roses did not notice what she was wearing. The afternoon air did not carry information about her to the network. She was simply there, in a garden, in August, in a house that was resting after a long effort. The sounds of the house were different. The particular sound of a household running at high intensity and now allowed to slow, quieter, slower. The mornings came in without urgency. The afternoon light moved across the walls at its own pace. The fires in the evenings were for warmth, not for the appearance of comfort that fires in a London drawing room were also required to provide. She wrote that those first weeks felt like finally being allowed to sit down. She'd been standing for 4 months, not literally, but the mental and social equivalent of standing, upright and visible and performing. August was the first chance to sit. The relief of it was specific and physical. Her body knew what it meant to no longer be performing, and it was glad. The formal season, in the precise form described across this script, ended officially in 1958, not because it had run out of participants, not because the families who had sustained it had lost the will to continue. It ended because Queen Elizabeth II made a specific decision. She announced that formal court presentations of debutantes would cease. After 1958, young women would no longer be presented at court, not in the way that had defined the season's opening ritual for more than 100 years. The palace's stated reason was that court presentations had become too broadly available. American Heiresses had been presented through sponsors for decades. Women from families with no meaningful connection to the original social network were moving through the ceremony. The presentation had ceased to function as the selective credential it was designed to be. It had become too accessible to serve its original purpose, so it was abolished. That is a particular kind of institutional death, not collapse, not failure. Abolition, because the mechanism had become insufficiently exclusive to justify maintaining. The season had been, for all its faults, a very precise instrument. By the 1950s, it is no longer precise. So it was ended. Women had held equal voting rights for 30 years when the season officially ended. They'd been in the workforce in significant numbers for decades. The world outside the season had changed entirely. The machinery had outlasted its own logic by a considerable margin. When it stopped, The stopping was barely remarked upon. The sound of carriage wheels on London cobblestones, from the palace gates in May when she was going towards something, to the country house roads in late July when she was going home, and now, finally, still. The dance card is in a drawer somewhere, the pencil still attached by its ribbon, some of the lines filled, some of them empty, the season over, the assessment concluded or inconclusive, the carriage returned, and the white gloves, soft in their tissue paper, still. What lasted was not the machinery, not the morning call circuit, not the court presentation or the network or the drawing rooms or the formal assessment. All of that is gone. The season as an institution ended in 1958 and did not continue. What lasted was what the season produced in the people inside it. The capacity to manage a public surface while running a private track underneath. To read a room at the same time as you're performing for it. To hold two things in your mind simultaneously, the appearance and the reality, and maintain both without either one collapsing. That is a specific kind of intelligence. The season spent 4 months refining it. The women who came out the other side of it were different from the women who had gone in, and they knew what they were doing. The letters are clear about this. The diaries are clear. They were not unaware of the machinery they were in. They understood it precisely. They could describe it with an accuracy that requires real intelligence to produce. They navigated it with a skill that required something more than compliance. They managed the surface while quietly observing everything the surface was designed to conceal. They were more than what the season was designed to see, and they knew that too. The white gloves on the hall table, in May, Preston knew. The whole season ahead. In August, folded in her lap in the carriage going home, the season concluded, one way or the other. She picked up the gloves in May. She held them in August. Same gloves. Different moment. Tonight, whatever the day asked of you, you don't have to curtsy. You don't have to manage the surface or read the room or hold two tracks simultaneously. You don't have to perform or assess or be assessed. Whatever the season of your own life has asked of you today, you can set it down now. Like white gloves on a hall table, set it down. It will be there in the morning. Let the shoulders drop. Let the hands rest. Let whatever was held upright by the day's requirements simply release. There is no drawing room here, no network running its assessments, no card tray by the door. Just the evening, and the slow work of the body finding its way towards stillness. 4 months at 17. That is what the season was in the end. 4 months that pointed a life in a direction it would follow for decades. The assessment ran and concluded, and the direction was set. Or the assessment ran and did not conclude, and the direction was set differently. Either way, 4 months was the measure of it. 4 months in which everything was at stake, and the stakes were entirely invisible to anyone who was not inside them. She carried all of that. She performed all of it. She navigated the assessment without letting it show on the surface, and she came out the other side knowing exactly what she'd been through, even if the formal world she had moved through would not acknowledge what it had asked of her. She knew. The letters and the diaries say so. She knew. And now the carriage is still. The carriage is finally still. It moved for 4 months. Through London mornings and evening balls and afternoon drawing rooms and the long queue to the palace. It carried everything the season required. It made the journey over and over through the same streets. Tonight it is still. The wheels have stopped. The sound of them on the cobblestones is gone. What remains is the quiet of a house that has done its work and is resting. The white gloves are folded, soft, in their tissue paper. The dance card is in the drawer, the pencil still on its ribbon. The lines that were filled are filled, the lines that were empty are empty. The season is over. Let the breath slow, let the weight of the day settle. The trunks are packed, the drawing rooms are dark. The city has released everyone and gone quiet. The garden in August is at its peak, everything grown out, everything resting in the particular fullness of a thing that has reached its season. The sound of the garden in summer, something moving through the roses slowly. The soft particular warmth of late evening air, nothing asking anything of anyone. The country house is quiet, the staff has settled. The fires in the grates are at steady low warmth. Nothing urgent, nothing pressing. Just the slow sounds of a house that is resting. Let the body settle now. Let the mind do what it does when nothing is asking anything of it. When there is no surface to manage. When the room does not need reading. The breath is slower now. The light is almost gone. The last of it resting on the garden wall, soft and warm. Moving away slowly. The roses are still. The evening air has cooled. Somewhere in the house, a door closes quietly. A sound like the house settling around itself, like a house that has done its work and is satisfied. Everything that needed to be carried today has been set down, the weight of it, gone. The breath moves on its own now, in and out, steady, nothing to direct it, nothing to require of it. The carriage is not moving. The wheels are still. The cobblestones are quiet. The city is far away. The garden is very close. The sounds of it coming through the window. Soft, warm, nothing that needs attention. Let the body settle now. Let the mind do what it does when nothing is asking anything of it. When there is no surface to manage. When the room does not need reading. When the day has been fully set down. The breath is slower now. The shoulders have released. The light is almost gone. The last of it resting on the garden wall, soft and warm and moving away. The roses are still. The sounds of the house are just the sounds of a house at rest. Everything that needed to be carried today has been set down. She's in the garden. Or she's in the upstairs room with the window open to the garden. The sounds coming in with the warm air. Nothing to manage. No surface to hold. She is simply there, in August, in the particular quiet of a world that has paused. The white gloves on the table, soft and still. The carriage is not going anywhere tonight. The garden sounds are steady, the same slow sound of a summer evening, the kind that does not change from minute to minute, the kind that has no information in it, just the warm air moving through the leaves and the particular stillness of a country house that has let the day go. The breath is very slow now. The light is gone. The room is warm. The sounds from the garden are soft and continuous and entirely without demand. She has put the gloves down. The dance card is in the drawer, the pencil on its ribbon. The season is done. The trunks are packed. The house is quiet. The carriage is still. The city is far away. The garden is warm and close. The breath is slow. The body is settled. There is nothing to manage, nothing to hold, nothing to carry. And the evening is, she has allowed herself, finally, to the room is warm. The breath is slow. The garden is still. The white gloves, soft. The dance card in the drawer. The pencil on its ribbon. The carriage is not going anywhere. Neither is she. Just this. Just the warm room and the soft air and the slow breath and the stillness of a summer evening that is not asking anything of anyone. Just this. She has allowed herself finally to rest, and so can you.